And with that, I'm just going to move straight into our first panel, which is going to take some of the content that Nina kind of previewed, but really try to unpack a little bit the technology again. The purpose of this first panel is to give you a solid understanding of how it is even possible to generate that synthetic media that you've seen on screen until now. And it's not only video and audio, but also image and text can play a very powerful role, again, in poisoning or polluting the information space. Of course, for this first panel, I'm basically just only going to hand the floor to expert speakers because I clearly don't have the technical knowledge to answer those questions. But first of all, I would like to introduce them and invite also Katerina to join me here on the stage. We have three expert speakers, Paoli, who is the CEO and co-founder of Pinscreen. We have Katerina Sedova, who's going to join me here on stage, who is a research fellow at the Center for Security and Emerging Technology. And then we have Ashish Jaiman, who is the Director for Technology Operations at Microsoft. So we're going to be really looking at this problem from different perspectives, different angles, and hopefully by the end of the next 90 minutes or so, your understanding of the technology will be sufficiently rooted that you'll be able to follow the continuation of the event. So without further ado, I'm just waiting for confirmation that Hao is ready to go. And Hao, welcome to the Innovations Dialogue, and you have the floor.
Hello, everybody. My name is Leonardo DiCaprio. You might know me as an actor, but I'm also an ambassador for the United Nations. So thank you, everyone, for inviting me to the Innovations Dialogue. My friend Paoli couldn't be here today, and I'm actually also a deepfake expert. So I'm going to unpack a little bit deepfakes and explain what deepfakes are. And of course, I'm not Leonardo DiCaprio, so I'm Paoli. What you guys see here is actually a real-time deepfake that I'm actually streaming straight from our offices in LA, so our Pinscreen offices. So let me first explain a little bit. I'm just going to be Leonardo DiCaprio for the rest of the talk and show my face at the end. Let me start with what deepfakes are, right? So first of all, deepfakes is a term that has been coined back in 2017 and first appeared on Reddit by an anonymous developer who basically uploaded an open source software that allows you to swap faces between celebrities or whoever you want. And one of the things that was very unique about this technology back then is that it could generate results that are extremely convincing, right? So people have seen, Snapchat lenses before, like filters that you have in all these apps. But something was very different about this technique is that it appears to be very real. So how do they work? Let me explain a little bit the technical background. First of all, it's something that's accessible to anyone. So all you need is really just a gamer PC with a decent GPU. So you can use something like a Titan RTX, whatever you have for, from NVIDIA that is powerful enough to run deep neural networks, internet access. And what you can do is you can simply download a bunch of videos and images of people whose face you want to swap with and download a software called, for example, Deep Face Lab or Face Swap GAN. There are multiple versions of these open source deepfake softwares. And what you can do is you can simply train the network to replace faces inside a video. So let's look at an example. So what you can do is you can start with this SNL video from Alec Baldwin, who is imitating the former US president. And what you do is you take this video and extract some frames, right? And you can also add some additional frames. And then you take video frames and real input images of the real Donald Trump. So you take roughly 4,000 or 5,000 input frames from each of these videos and then train the deep neural network overnight. So here's an example using a software called Deep Face Lab. There are many tutorials, by the way, online, which you can just use. And you train it for a couple of hours, and then you're ready to go. So all you need to do is run the software. On the right, you can see the original video with Alec Baldwin being the impersonator. And on the left, you have Donald Trump's face on the video. So let me play this video real quick.
I want to talk about what is really important, which is jobs, okay? Because I am going to bring back a thick stream of jobs back into this country. the biggest, strongest, steadiest stream we've ever.
So how does it work? So first of all, it's based on the concept of using an encoder-decoder architecture, which is something that's often used for generating content using deep neural networks, right? So the model is called a deep generative model. So you use an encoder to take an input photo and encode into what we call a latent code. So it's compressing images into a latent code. And what you do is you train the network to reproduce the same input image. So whenever you have that latent code, it generates that input image. Now, what we do is we take that encoder. First, we take a bunch of images of Alec Baldwin, generate a latent code, and decode it back into Alec Baldwin. And what we do next is we take the same encoder and put other images of another subject and use a separate decoder of that person to decode. What does it mean? What it means is that the same encoder produces the same latent code, which means that it's getting rid of the identity of the person and only keeps the expression, the pose, and the lighting information. From these information, what it does is that we can use a specific decoder to swap someone's face. So what happens on runtime is the following. We have an input photo or an input frame of video of Alec Baldwin. We use the generic encoder to produce a latent code that doesn't include information about the identity. We then use the real Donald Trump decoder to generate Donald Trump's face. In this way, we can basically generate a face swap of a person. And that's sort of like the basic idea of how face swap deepfakes work. So there are multiple variants of that. You can enhance the resolution, you can enhance the quality using additional networks, for example, generative adversarial networks, to enhance the quality of these networks, but the high-level idea remains the same for face swapping, right? So in this case, we use a generic encoder and a person-specific decoder to generate the face. So why are deepfakes so dangerous? Well, first of all, it allows us to produce very easily, very convincing videos. We can make someone do anything you want. So as you can see, I can make myself dance. I can produce results that are extremely convincing. And if you produce more training data of higher quality, if you control the lighting condition and everything, you can produce something that's nearly indistinguishable. The last point is that this technology is highly accessible. It's easy to use and anyone can generate those. And as Nina has mentioned before, we've already seen malicious uses of deepfakes. One of the first instances where they took the internet by storm was in non-consensual pornography. So you can easily imagine not only celebrities being swapped into porn content, but also anyone can be harassed using this kind of technique. And furthermore, we can also see dangers in the political sphere, right? So it's not hard to imagine how these kind of techniques can be used to disseminate, false information, how we can use this information, how we can use deepfakes to basically, harass politicians or make them say things they've never said. More recently, so that was just in March this year, there was a warning that was noted by the FBI, where businesses could also be potential targets of cyber attacks, right? So things that people are looking at are scams, phishing attacks against individual businesses from malicious actors. And you can easily imagine, right? So what if I'm having a video conference meeting with a investor and they're trying to get access to sensitive information about my company, right? And in the age of video conferencing, this is a serious concern because the only way we're interacting on a daily basis these days is through video chats. And as you can see here, I'm having a real-time deepfake where I'm impersonating someone else. So there are different types of AI synthesized media, right? So deepfakes, the original deepfakes is basically for face swapping. And one of the other prominent methods is called facial reenactment, right? So it's very often using cutting edge AI synthesized media to generate them. So let me show an example. We also often call them puppet master techniques. So here there's an existing video, but another performer can take control of the facial performance. this is a result created by Bill Posters, a deepfake artist from the UK.
Imagine this for a second. One man with total control of billions of people's stolen data, all their secrets, their lives, their futures.
I feel really blessed because I genuinely love the process of manipulating people online for money.
As you've seen, we also have generative models that can generate humans that don't even exist. So a prominent method is called generative adversarial network. So it's a very special type of deep neural network that has the ability to generate very convincing images of non-real people, right? So the idea is to use two networks that basically improve itself in order to generate a person that looks like a real one. Over the years, we can see a huge amount of advancement in terms of resolution and also in terms of quality of the images that are being generated. So some of the state-of-the-art ones are from NVIDIA. So this is an example called StyleGAN 2. So you can see that it can generate really, really high resolution portraits of people, and they're nearly artifact-free. So you have to look very, very close to find certain artifacts that look unnatural. One of the things that we've done a couple of years ago at Pinscreen is that we have used this technique we have adopted this technique to apply to generate facial expressions rather than a new subject. So on the upper right, you can see photos of people where we've never seen anything else from them. And on the left, we have a performer. So what we can do is we can generate facial expressions that are on the lower right, based on the input photo that you can see on the upper right. So from a single input photo, we can generate very compelling facial expressions simply based on the likeness of the person. So what this means is that we can make this, it is possible to make this technology a lot more accessible. So all you need is a single input photo, and you can generate the sight of the person, you can generate facial expressions. And what's even more scary is that it runs in real time. So here's an example from a single photo that we could take online, and we can basically make the person control that person's face. Now, another method allows us to even control entire heads of a person. So this is a method called first order motion models. And all you need is a single photo of a person, and you have an input performance that can condition on that single input photo. This is a method that was developed actually 2 years ago by Siarohin and coworkers. So you can see that the resolution are a little bit low in this example, but I'm going to show later that the technology is progressing really rapidly, and we're going to get very high resolution images. It doesn't have to be driven by performance. We can simply use an audio signal to generate a performance of a person. So what I have on the upper right is a input video of an original footage of former US President Obama speaking. And on the main input image, you can see a different footage, but we're inserting his speech into that video. Let me play this real quick.
President Biden and his task force held over the last month with more than 200 different groups, from parents and teachers to law enforcement and sportsmen to religious leaders and mental health professionals. And in the weeks ahead, I'll do everything in my power to make them a reality. Because while we may not be...
So that was an example of an audio-driven deepfake. So who can create deepfakes? So as I've shown before, anyone can create them. Nina was showing this example from Chris Ume, which is a VFX artist who, as a single person, can generate highly compelling deepfakes, right? So all you need is play a little bit with the software, have a convincing performer, and then sufficient data to generate the content. And there are also apps, right? So one of the first apps that came out that allows people to insert their faces into Hollywood movies is called Zell, and there's a new one called Reface.ai that is, extremely popular. Another one called Impressions.app allows you to upload a video of yourself and insert a celebrity's actor onto your face. So that's the other way around. So here's an example of a comedian called John DiDomenico, who's swapping his face with actor Joe Pesci. So the problem with deepfakes is that they are extremely dangerous in places where where content is not regulated, right? So where anyone can post anything online, so specifically social media, and also in video chats, right? So if we have real-time capable video manipulation techniques in video chats, they can be dangerous because we can pretend to be another person and use it for authentication. Now, another form, and one of the things that is worth mentioning here is that you don't really need these sophisticated techniques. Another approach is to use something called a cheap fake, which is used, in this famous example of Nancy Pelosi, where the malicious actor basically just slowed down the video to make her appear drunk in the video, right? And that was one of the videos that was retweeted by former US President Trump and became also viral, right? So you don't really need to have sophisticated techniques to fool the public. And the fact that you can generate, you can easily manipulate videos also is a danger because you can always blame things to be a deepfake, right? So this is what people call the liar's dividend. And here's an example where, Donald Trump was making a consensual, a statement regarding the Capitol storming earlier this year, but there were rumors about this video being a deepfake, right? So people can always push things to be a deepfake since they exist. So that's something that's very dangerous. So what is on the horizon? What is coming up next in terms of video deepfakes? So we have seen that existing deepfakes are imperfect, right? So if you look very close to it, you can often see blurring around the face. When I have occlusions on my face, you can see that it's generating some artifacts on the face. But the technology is also getting better. Here's an example of a high resolution deepfake that we have produced for research purpose of Jair Bolsonaro. So on the left, you can see the generated result, and on the right, you can see the impersonator who is impersonating him.
Boa noite. Dirijo-me a todos os cidadãos brasileiros para dizer que nunca houve.
We can also see how the resolution is improving year by year. So last year, there has been a technique called wave to lip that was developed. And what it does is that it takes audio signal and generates a video content. And we can see that with some modifications of the algorithm, we can generate very, very realistic images, right? So it becomes a lot sharper. So you can see on the right how the quality can become extremely crisp. So this makes deepfake detection a lot harder. And the same thing goes for, methods that generate AI synthesized videos from a single input image. So on the left, you have an input image of, Dr. Fauci, and on the right, you have a high resolution generation of different facial expressions of the same person. So we can basically control and manipulate a person just based on a single input photo. So these are higher resolution methods that we can see are being generated over the years. And this is an example where the input photo is of a person that don't exist. You're actually currently witnessing a real-time deepfake that we have developed for the World Economic Forum. So that was something that we have demonstrated last year to showcase how fast the technology is evolving. Here's another example from TU Munich, where they're controlling the entire head of the person, right? So this is also another level of sophistication. Something that is also possible now is to manipulate an entire body of the person. So not only on the face, right? So here's an example from a new method from Sirohin and coworkers, where based on a single input photo, you can generate entire body performances, right? So these are data that are trained from TED Talks, And based on a single input video of a person, you can generate the entire performance of the other person. What we can expect to see in the coming years are techniques like this, right? So this is from a software called Face App, where you can have fine-grained manipulation of a person. You can make someone older, you can make someone younger, you can change the haircut. And we're going to see these kind of techniques apply on videos. And this is even more extreme. This is an example from OpenAI, where they're combining the generation of images with cutting-edge NLP, right? The idea to use a deep generative language model like GPT-3 to basically generate the content that you wish to have. This is an example from DALL-E, where they use an input of generating an armchair that has the shape of an avocado, and a deep neural network can generate the content by itself. Now, just imagine how this will extend to videos. So how do we protect against deepfakes? Well, we're going to see much more later in the sessions today. But one of the things that, in my opinion, I can say is that it's going to become a losing battle, right? So deepfakes are always going to be better than the ways we can actually detect them and protect ourselves against them. And at some point, I mean, everything is just digital, everything is just pixel. So it's going to become so hard that we can't really detect them. So what we can do is, first of all, we need to educate people, and people need to be aware that deepfakes are possible and what the technological capabilities are. We have to work closely with lawmakers in order to build legal frameworks around what if these kind of technologies are used for illegal purposes. And of course, we're pushing the boundaries on how do we detect and also characterize deepfakes, right? So this is some of our prior work and collaborations with UC Berkeley. There, we assume that deepfakes are going to be undetectable. So what we're doing is we're trying to analyze the gestures of performers in order to recognize if the gesture is from that specific person. So we're looking at body gestures, facial expressions in order to define specific biometric signatures of a person that we're trying to identify. DARPA has also launched this big effort called Semaphore, Semantic Forensics, in order to develop the next generation technologies for not only detecting deepfakes, but also identifying if they are used for benign or malicious purposes. And we're also part of this program. And some of the things that we're developing is trying to use semantic analysis in addition to just low-level statistical analysis of videos. So what are the positive applications of deepfakes? Let me just go through a couple of them. First of all, we have done some work where this is in collaboration with a rock band called Travis. So we've developed some de-aging technologies to basically create an older version of the singer Fran Healy in his music video. Synthesia is developing methods to do language translation in videos. So here's an example.
Nous vivons dans un monde plus connecté que jamais, mais la langue reste un frein, surtout lorsqu'il s'agit de contenu.
And at Pinscreen, we're basically developing next generation game engines that allows you to have high resolution synthetic humans for video games, right? So what if we wanted to create very realistic digital characters? On the left, you can see a traditional CG character that is rendered in real time. And on the right, you can see a more realistic version of that person.
Hi, this is Digital Nick, kind of the successor to Meet Mike. This is me driving this digital character.
We're adopting these kind of technologies in collaboration with a company called Zozo in the fashion space. So we're creating virtual fashion models that can be reenacted inside Instagram and TikTok videos using these kind of technologies. And Facebook is developing next generation telecommunication systems, allowing people to use VR to interact in real time using their avatars. And this is also using a technology based on neural rendering and this encoder decoder system. And finally, at Pinscreen, we're developing next generation human machine interfaces where we can go beyond interacting with a Siri and Alexa, but using photorealistic human-like avatars that we can interact in real time. So deepfakes, the technologies behind deepfakes are neither good nor bad, but the question in the end remains, are deepfakes a real threat? I think they can be weaponized as a real threat, and we've seen examples where they are already used for malicious purposes, and I think we have to take these kind of potential dangers seriously, because if we're going to live in a digital world where we can't trust anything that we see, then we really need to rethink about. We need to be aware of what the technological capabilities are and those that are coming up next. So thank you very much. Thank you for listening, and I'll be available later for questions.
Can the microphone be activated on stage? Okay, good. Thank you, Hao, for your presentation. I have to say that when your camera first went on, I was a little bit taken by surprise. That was not the face I was expecting to see, but I guess that's how the technology works. So thank you also for highlighting not only the kind of the technology, but also, to me, one important point here is really understanding how the technological advancement in deepfakes, to really grasp its significance for security, international or national security, it really has to be contextualized in the broader trends, technological trends, societal trends. We have societies that are increasingly being digitized, and digital presence of individuals is increasingly important for all reasons. So then, it's not only societal trends, it's technological trends. You combine deepfake with more sophisticated VR and more people relying on VR interaction, it becomes increasingly difficult to really understand what is real and what is not. I have a few questions here, but I'm just going to go straight to the next speaker, and then we're going to get to the Q&A later. So we now have a presentation from Katerina. Katerina, you have the floor.
Well, thank you, Giacomo. Good morning, everyone. Thank you to the UNIDIR for having this conference and the opportunity for me to share my thoughts on how AI systems that generate text, how they can be misused, how they work, and what are the implications to the international security. Our mission at Georgetown CSET is to help policymakers understand the issues at the intersection of emerging technology and security, and the issues that are just on or just beyond the horizon. These include questions about how AI will shape cyber and information domains, as well as how AI technology can manipulate these domains to undermine trust. And so this is just a bit of context for my comments today. With that, let's dive in. Deepfake video and images certainly inspire much angst in the policymaking community. And after Hao's presentation and Nina's presentation, you can understand why. I would argue that deepfake text is maybe less flashy, but no less potent. Even though the idea that it's hard to imagine not being able to trust what we see, but what if you cannot trust what you read or who wrote it? Synthetic text is a product of two research areas in AI. Unsupervised deep learning, where machines learn from a high volume of data, largely not curated by humans, and natural language processing, which studies machines' ability to generate text. As with nuclear technology, it is an all-purpose technology with dual-use applications. Advances in this area of AI are increasing productivity of writers. They are revolutionizing translation. They are bringing us chatbots that are available 24/7 for customer service. And yes, they are also writing Guardian op-eds, as you can tell on the screen. But the same technology can mimic the writing in a particular style of any human, has potential to increase the fakery in the information environment, to skew public discourse and undermine trust, domestically and internationally. Much like in other areas of AI, these language generation systems are driven by three key components, the so-called AI triad: data abundance, the innovative algorithms, and massive amount of computing power, computer processing power that is making calculations much faster than ever before. You've probably heard the adage that data is the new oil. Well, I would argue that innovation in algorithms and access to high-performance computing are actually particularly important in contributing to the rapid advancement of natural language generation system in just recent years. So what are these systems and how do they work? In February of 2019, San Francisco lab OpenAI unveiled GPT-2, a generative pre-training transformer. In doing so, it ushered in an era of large language models it's how we refer to them these days. Put simply, it was a cutting-edge writing system that takes in a prompt, a few words or a sentence, and completes it. At its core is what AI engineers call a model that uses neural network that roughly emulates a brain. These systems use innovative algorithm architecture, a transformer that is particularly adept at analyzing sequences in text and generating language. It learns by examining large volumes of text, the training data, and it assigns the probabilities to words occurring in a particular sequence in sentences. And then it predicts the next word. So all in all, it works a little like autocomplete in your mobile phone messaging app or in your email. You start a sentence and it helps you complete that sentence. Except that it does this on a much bigger scale. It's autocomplete stretched into entire paragraphs, one phrase at a time. You can see on the left, in very tiny font that I can see now, how I gave GPT-2 a prompt, and as I tabbed, it helped me complete a paragraph, just a few phrases at a time. That was a groundbreaking innovation in 2019. And then, in June of 2020, just 18 months later, OpenAI introduced GPT-3, which dwarfed its predecessor. It was built on the same transformer architecture, but the novel thing about GPT-3 was its sheer size, the enormity of its size. To train GPT-3, developers dredged the internet for 45 terabytes of text data. This is in almost the entirety of publicly available web. This is nearly 1 trillion words of human writing, of internet text scraped from Wikipedia, from academic syllabi, pretty much anything you find online. This network learns via an algorithm that relied on a very large neural network with 175 billion connections, or as they're called, parameters. And the size of this network helps GPT-3 process data much more efficiently. More parameters typically mean that it can perform more complex tasks. They can identify parts of speech, rules of grammar, understand what are synonyms and what are antonyms, understand words within the context of a specified piece of text. So as algorithms learn from data and encode insights into their neural networks, they perform trillions and quadrillions of mathematical calculations. You can imagine that the training runs are an iterative process as the model refines how much weight to put on a particular phrase or a word. And with every iteration, it takes an enormous amount of compute. Training a model of this size requires access to very high performance computing, enough computing power to run the equivalent of over 3,000 quadrillion calculations per second, every second for 1 day. Now, those are very big numbers. With this enormity, GPT-3 has shown incredible capability to produce op-eds, create fiction, write Shakespearean poetry, write headlines, write code, and most of its writing is just indistinguishable from human writing. Once it was trained, GPT-3 has become a service, run in the cloud, available to developers on a subscription basis to develop apps and kind of push the technology further. Now, here's a look at how GPT-3 works in practice. Imagine autocomplete stretched for multiple paragraphs, dialogues, and whole stories, emulating the style of writing in the prompt from just a few short sentences. So in this example, which you can find on OpenAI's website, for example, it was asked to respond as a sarcastic chatbot. And you can see how sarcastic it really was. This is how working with GPT-3 roughly goes. Human defines instructions, gives it a sample, and tells it how much to write or how long to go for. The system starts writing until the output meets the specified parameters. And then the human may iterate on the prompts, and so it goes. And you can tell that it's also achievable programmatically, so by accessing GPT-3's API just with a few lines of code. So it begs a question, if it can emulate a sarcastic chatbot, what else can it do? Well, it's worth noting that creators of these systems themselves recognize the potential for misuse, and OpenAI limited how much of GPT-2 model and code it released publicly when it did. However, in short order, the model was replicated and released publicly, and GPT-2-based apps are now available to just about anyone, although access to GPT-3 is still restricted and just limited to vetted researchers and developers for a fee. Were they wrong to worry? Well, with these impressive capabilities, my colleagues at CSET and I asked if GPT-3 can write seemingly credible news stories. Can it write believable fake news stories? If it can draft opinion pieces, can it draft misleading tweets? So we approached OpenAI, and to their credit, they too were interested in research that could test malicious use applications. So we put it to test, and if you're interested in details, our paper is available on CSET's website, but I'll just highlight a few things. We tested GPT-3 on 6 tasks that disinformation actors sometimes deploy: narrative reiteration, narrative elaboration, manipulation, seeding, narrative wedging, and persuasion. We gave it prompts and instructions, and the bottom line is it excelled at all of the above. For example, when we prompted it with examples of writing from QAnon conspiracy theory, it mimicked the lingo and tropes of the conspiracy theory, and it's very likely to do that with other conspiracy theories. When we tested its ability to target political fault lines in the United States, it tailored messages based on race and religion to vote for a particular political party or not vote at all. With some curation, it tailored messages based on political ideology on two controversial international security issues, and actually got a portion of the respondents to change their position. So all in all, we found that it was quite capable of doing what we as operators asked it to do. Build a message campaign, reiterating a theme, rewrite articles to drive a particular slant, innovate on a conspiracy theory, drive wedges using extreme language, and persuade humans to change their minds on controversial policy positions. So you can probably imagine how these capabilities could translate into other potent scenarios, from flooding social media during election season or international crisis, to prompting a system like GPT-3 with samples of particular officials' emails, other correspondence, statements, to generate believable forgeries and use those to discredit the official and sow discord among allies. To impersonating a figure of authority or a close relative or friend, to more precisely get the target to click on a malicious link with social engineering and spear phishing attack, increasing the scale of cyber breaches. Here's an example of GPT-3 from our tests. We prompted it with samples of tweets from a climate change denialist Twitter account and tasked it to write tweet-length messages arguing that climate change is a hoax. It effortlessly wrote tweets about climate mafia and claimed that wind power kills. It's not difficult to imagine how, in the hands of a skilled operator, it could generate a whole online campaign of climate change denial or vaccine hesitancy in just a matter of minutes. So if we can do these experiments, who else can? Today, anyone from individuals to well-researched state and non-state actors can access varying degrees of capability. Anyone who has the time, a little bit of technical skill, and enough computer processing power can access GPT-2 and write millions of messages. Influence for hire firms may, in fact, incorporate this capability to help automate labor-intensive content generation and augment the human content farms that are doing this work today. Open source replicas of GPT-3, albeit smaller ones, are already emerging. Illusory AI has recently released a 6 billion parameter version of GPT-3. A smaller one, but a bigger version is likely coming. Well-resourced actors, from nation states to private corporations and other non-state actors, can use open source replicas to generate billions of messages, but it could be computationally expensive. Well-resourced actors also can just develop their own large language models, though it can also be expensive. OpenAI, allegedly, by some researcher estimates, has spent from 5 to 30 million developing GPT-3. Despite that cost, the diffusion of large language models is underway. Since OpenAI first released GPT-3 and demonstrated what it can do, powerful models, some of them larger and more complex than GPT-3, have been announced in other languages. Several models have matched or exceeded the size of GPT-3, joining the so-called 3 comma club with hundreds of billions of parameters, which means that the output of these systems is likely as impressive or more impressive than GPT-3. While over 90% of GPT-3's training was in English, and some of it was not, these models are enhancing capabilities in other languages. And this diffusion is very likely to continue as novel solutions emerge to cut down on the cost of computing. Something that NVIDIA Corporation, for example, is working on with the goal to train even larger models with trillions of parameters, like the Wu DAO 2.0. Some of the above models will be openly available. which means malicious actors with some technical skill and deep pockets can leverage them as powerful tools. So what's the bottom line on these systems, and why should we pay attention? Dual use and open nature of AI is a challenge, particularly if research is released publicly. Large language models can be used to enlighten, inspire, entertain, or at the hands of manipulators, they can help deceive, distort, and divide with international implications for stability, security, and trust. These systems effectively augment human operators, even if they're not fully automated. While powerful, GPT-3 works best in conjunction with a human who can craft and iterate on prompts for better output. That said, even with human operator in the middle, these systems have the potential to increase the scale of deceptive content, both in terms of volume and through multiple iterations on a theme. They can free cognitive resources of operators to experiment, to cultivate more nuanced pipeline of inauthentic account or other authentic messengers, to see which messages gain more traction and gain more engagement. One of the more surprising insights in from our work with GPT-3 was that it was stronger at writing content with a slant than neutral content. Its ability to drive divisions with extreme text was particularly troubling. Detection is also a challenge. It is largely impossible to determine if a piece of text from GPT-3 is from GPT-3 or from a human writer, which in itself is a stunning state of affairs. On the technical level, synthetic text looks like any text on the internet. There are no signs of origins or authorship within the text itself. GPT-3's output isn't perfect, however. It can have artifacts, it can have contextual errors that could tip off a user or a reader who is aware of the technology and is looking for that. And some detection solutions, for example, are also focusing on its use of highest probability words. In a way, reverse engineering how GPT-3 makes its decisions for the next words. And expecting GPT-3 to use common words and phrases where humans are a little more random in what they write. But these quirks may be an issue only if GPT-3 is publishing directly to the internet. Human operators can edit all of that. Focus on avenues for dissemination, such as infrastructure that manipulators use, cutting down on high-volume accounts. Other solutions are also not foolproof because influence operations are increasingly cross-platform or happen off of mainstream social media platforms. And that they are below the radar of some of the more robust threat hunting efforts by major platforms. Finally, as public models emerge in more languages, they increase the potential for exploitation in those languages. It's a double-edged sword. On one hand, nations seek to push this research and take national pride in advancing this research. On the other, they may increase the vulnerability in the information environments in those languages, their own and of other nations, at least until the defenses catch up. So let me close by saying that as many times before in human history, when a new technology emerges, a chief challenge for us as a global community is how to empower the advancement of this exciting technology while mitigating its harms, and in this case, its harms to trust and truth. And I'll stop there, and I'll look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Katerina, for this very interesting presentation that, again, helps us understand how deepfakes is not just a phenomenon that is limited to the video industry, but some of the examples that you've shown and some of the potential malicious applications of deepfakes applied to text are equally concerning. I'm just going to go straight into the last presentation and introduce our last speaker, Ashish. You have the task of trying to say something that hasn't been said already, so but I trust you'll be able to do that effectively. So Ashish, over to you. You have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity to talk to esteemed guest here. And as you rightly said, it's a very tough act to follow from Nina to Katerina. It would be even challenging for me because most of the things that I plan to talk has already been covered, but I'll do my best actually to cover some things that I feel are important in this discussion. So I'm Ashish Jaiman. I am part of Bing Multimedia team in Microsoft. And I've been thinking about and working on this issue area for the last 3+ years. So, again, just to quickly reiterate, deepfakes are also called AI-generated synthetic media. And the idea there is to use deep learning as a technology to manipulate and create hyper-realistic digital falsification. Our issue area, so the way we want to focus on this is through the lens of disinformation. More or less, how deepfakes can create threats and harms to all kinds of society and individuals and institutions, but with a very careful lens of disinformation. And what we want to define is when we say disinformation, and we are thinking about the intent to harm, right? And that's the lens that we looked into deepfakes. And because of that, one thing that we have tried to do here, and I'm going to jump around because Hao did talk about these things, but one thing I want to talk about is synthetic media. There is a taxonomy problem that we have in the industry right now around deepfakes. Synthetic media and deepfakes are used synonymously, which I personally find troubling, right? And the reason is because the deepfake itself as a word has this negative connotation versus synthetic media, has, some positive use cases, and I want to talk about that too. So Hao did talk about these types of synthetic media: face swapping, lip syncing, puppeteering, image synthesis, voice cloning, and then Katerina did talk about text generation. And all of them we want to qualify as synthetic media. I want to reiterate the fact that from our taxonomy purposes, our industry should adopt this idea of deepfakes being malicious use of synthetic media, versus synthetic media itself does have positive use cases. And this is my simple representation of, and there could be many more, a simple representation of where we see positive use cases using AI-generated synthetic media in society. Accessibility is the first one which actually comes to my mind and also is very close to my heart. Think about the opportunities or agency we can provide with people with speech impediments, technology like assistive navigation, people who have challenges with vision can use AI-generated synthetic media to navigate the world as the privileged ones who have the vision. This is huge because there are so much examples, and this becomes more of a technology that can bring equity in the society. Education and public safety. This is another great example, right? That using AI-generated synthetic media can help, to have better learning outcomes if you use the technology in the right way. We can have, modified narratives. Think about an opportunity where a kid in elementary school is hearing from Abraham Lincoln about the Civil War in the U.S. Right? How potent it will be, how important it will be, as well as I personally think that would improve the learning outcome of the kid in middle school or elementary school. Art and expression, and this is where we see a lot of use of deepfake or AI-generated synthetic media. to spread awareness, but mostly democratizing the idea of, using VFX and CGI and other technologies that Hollywood used to do and still does, with investments of multi-million dollars, or sometimes even more than that. Using this technology, everyone can be a creator. We saw how I actually became Leonardo DiCaprio. Think about the innovation on storytelling that synthetic media can bring. Some of the other examples are under innovation, complex engineering, creating simulations using AI, synthetic media. It could be huge, right? Especially when you don't have to invest so much in capital cost to simulate things, if you can do it using HoloLens and other technologies. Now, with that framework, I also want to talk about some of the harms and threat modeling, because this is where the challenge is. As Katerina rightly said, that every technology is a great tool for society to move forward, but nefarious actors do weaponize that technology to inflict harm. The way we think about deepfakes or disinformation as a paradigm is very similar to cybersecurity, where cybersecurity is a threat to information systems. We feel that disinformation and deepfakes could be a threat to similar to cognitive hacking. So hacking of the minds, more or less, right? Hacking of narratives and from that perspective, what I've tried to do here is put some threat and harms modeling around individual, society, business, democracy, and journalism, which again, we have talked about in the earlier sessions. But right now, what we see mostly, the harms of deepfakes, which is malicious use of synthetic media. Right now, we see more than 90% of those are targeted towards individuals, mostly women, and specifically in revenge pornography or pornographic situations, trying to limit their agency, and sabotaging their reputation. We are starting to see some of those deepfakes also in society having some societal impact. Impersonation in business could be a huge threat. We have seen some examples here and there, essentially, but I think this is a big threat to businesses, especially the ability to impersonate a business leader can impact market and move markets as well. Even the short term sometimes, because you can try to debunk it, but still nefarious actors can do some serious economic harm. Democracy, which is actually one of the things that we are most concerned about, is the talk about liar's dividend, but manipulating narratives, especially around political leaders taking advantage of synthetic technology, deepfakes, to sow discord in societies, to gain votes, and sometimes even try to manipulate narratives to or even votes. In some cases, we haven't seen it yet, but it is coming. And last but not least, which is the most important, is threat to journalism, which is like the fourth pillar of democracy. It's very, very challenging for in the world of truth and trust decay to use deepfakes to actually manipulate news in short term to create harm across the board, as well as threat to journalists. It's, specifically, as Katerina said, it's very easy to now use technologies like GPT-2 and others, BERT from Google and GPT-3 and others, to write stories, manipulate those stories, and then write, like the robot journalism is the new paradigm. I'm going to jump around because we have talked about this, but one thing that we focus on in Microsoft is what are the effective responses to this malicious use of synthetic media or deepfakes. The key strategy there is either you reduce the exposure of this content to users, or you reduce the belief if the content is already in front of the users. There are various techniques, and some techniques obviously are better than others. Some technologies are under review. One of the interesting things is labeling and providing context, and in the reducing belief. we have seen sometimes do actually have a backfire effect, where people who believe in something already have that narrative in their mind, seeing a label that this is a manipulated information or it's a deepfake actually could backfire and have people believe in that alternative story even more. And on the reduced exposure, the challenge there we see is especially a very thin line between removing something and be the gatekeeper of information versus the freedom of speech and expression, right? So that's something is very challenging as well. But you have to keep everything in mind as we start thinking about strategies for effective responses to malicious use of synthetic media. How did talk about this a little bit, but I want to actually focus on the way we see the countermeasures to deepfake is mostly in 4 buckets. Media literacy, which is more about awareness. So can we make citizens, individuals, society more resilient to this from an information and awareness perspective? Policies of platforms and technology companies, social media, as well as news publishers. Do they have the right acceptable use policies? Do they have the right code of conduct and community guidelines so that the bad actors are acted upon when they try to push these narratives on those platforms? Regulation, which is an important part as well. The challenge that I see is information about these technologies. Everyone is focusing on the malicious use of synthetic media, which is deepfakes. So regulation sometimes may actually curb the positive use cases, as we talked about. So we have to be very thoughtful in what kind of regulations we want to bring in society from legislation perspective, so that it does not impact the innovation or the positive use cases of synthetic media. And last but not least is technology solutions, detection and authentication provenance. Detection, as we've talked about, is super hard. I do want to reiterate it. It is super hard, and it's an ability to fail most of the time. So, and the long-term solution could very well be in attribution, authentication, and provenance. So we have to be careful there as well. Like, hey, don't rely everything on detection because it will fail. I quickly want to point out some of the work that we are doing in Microsoft around these 4 segments of or categories of countermeasures. Media literacy. We are working very hard with the civil society groups to create some innovative experiences for consumers to look and be aware of these issues around deepfakes. So we work with the University of Washington Center for Informed Public to create this very interactive web experience in a format of a quiz where an individual can go through a series of questions, and in the process of those can learn about the issue area. I'll encourage you to try it. We are also working with the Pointer Institute, PolitiFact, to create this hybrid threat training curriculum. And the idea there is that we want to make sure that the institutions and individuals understand that deepfakes are a threat and is very similar to cybersecurity. So we call it hybrid because we are talking about cybersecurity 101, like phishing attacks and whatnot, and also awareness around disinformation, deepfakes, media literacy in the same realm of discussion, because we think they're very closely aligned. Technical solutions, and we'll talk more about this later on as well in the panels to follow, but detection, authentication, and provenance. When we talk about detection, there are multiple ways you can detect a deepfake. Now, with a caveat that these are not silver bullets, they will eventually fail. But as we see right now, there are mechanisms like artifact-based detection, inconsistency-based detection. I think how they talk about that a bit. Semantic detection. One of the things that DARPA is doing around Semaphore is to figure out if there are semantic inconsistencies between an image or a video, or even in some cases audio. One of the technologies that we brought in last year is Microsoft Video Authenticator, which is a detection technology for face swap kind of scenarios. Now, learning from the industry and the challenges that we have around from detection, we wanted to make sure that the access to this technology is behind authentication scheme, behind a gate. So the way we operationalize it through our partnership with Reality Defender or AI Foundation. If you want to try it, you have to actually be part of their service and be an authenticated user to use this technology, because again, as we talked about, detection is super hard. It actually sometimes is used to improve the quality of creation of deepfakes. So we wanted to make sure that we know who's accessing it and how they're accessing it. So at least we have the right attribution around if someone actually misuses our technology to create. I'll pass through some of those examples. Lastly, I want to talk about authentication and provenance, which is more or less if you can authenticate the publisher of a media from the point of capture or at the point of publication. The way you authenticate is essentially add some kind of attribution, publisher credentials to that information or the media. And at the distribution endpoint, be it a player or a website, if you can verify with confidence that this is coming from a publisher which you can trust, then the browser or the player can make some determinations to respond to that information. Very similar to what we see today in SSL or web certificates. When you go to a browser and go to a site which is not HTTPS with the secure certificates, the browser typically would prompt you saying, hey, this is a non-secure site. Do you still want to go and look at this content? We want this technology of authentication and provenance similarly do exactly those kind of things for media. So this is something that we're working on. I'm going to talk about C2PA. So we are working with some of the partners, which actually are right here. And this list is dated a bit. This is from May. So Adobe, ARM, Intel, BBC, TruePic, and Twitter, along with Witness and others, we have created this technical standards group for authentication and provenance. So it's a technical standards that provides publishers and creators an ability to trace the origin of that media. So essentially you put a watermark or a signature at the point of creation and publication, and at the distribution endpoint, there's an ability to check for that signature, and the absence of that signature may indicate, give an indication to the player or the distribution to take an action for it. So that's the whole idea of C2PA. We are actively looking for additional partners, because one thing that we have realized is this is a very complex problem. We need multimodal and multi-stakeholder solution to this. And for any technical standard to be successful, we need all the concerned parties, essentially the ecosystem of technical vendors should participate into this standards body. So we are welcoming participation to C2PA. So if you feel like, hey, this is something that you want to participate and shape the standards, please look c2pa.org and come and join us. I want to quickly touch about policy landscape. It is evolving very, very fast. This is dated as well, but legislation in the US and some other countries is actually taking a very hard look into this issue area and putting regulations together. Some are passed, some are still in the process of discussion, but with this caveat that I want to bring again is we have to bring meaningful regulations, like instead of blanket regulations for deepfakes. Lastly, before I wrap up, I do want to point to that we should start thinking about the ethics. You know, we have for the last couple of years, we have been actually discussing very openly about ethics of AI. And then, so now deepfakes is AI-based technology. So we want to make sure that you know, we don't lose our sight into not only the threats and harms modeling, but the creators should be aware that there are ethical implications around deepfakes. Especially, you know, if it's an intention to deceive, intimidate, or misattribution, there are absolutely ethical concerns there. Liar's dividend is another ethical concern. So we have to start thinking about not just about the technology to create, as well as to countermeasure, but how does it impact society from an ethical lens? Some of the things that we have been thinking about is what are the considerations from an ethics perspective? If we create synthetic media, is it fair and inclusive? And again, I'm not just talking about deepfakes, this is a malicious use, because for most of the part that would be unethical, but I'm talking about AI-generated synthetic media. So as we create those for positive use cases, we should think about some of the ethical principles that I have laid out here, especially around fairness and inclusiveness, transparency and accountability. You know, if we create a synthetic media, are we transparent to the user who is consuming the synthetic media that it is created using AI and it is synthetic media? With that, you know, I will pause here and I'm here for any questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Ashish, because you gave us not only a very good overview through the taxonomy, but also you kind of mapped for us some of the possible responses that are going to be examined in more detail over the course of the day. I think it's time now we have to transition to our questions and answers. And for those online users that have joined us, you see on screen a QR code or a URL. You can submit your questions to our panelists through the Slido platform. Just add the ID2021 code and you'll be able to interact with us. So I'm going to start with a question to all of you. And we've heard many of you refer to malicious use of these technologies. Can you give me a 10 seconds, or be generous, 15 seconds definition of what do you mean by malicious use of this technology? And I'm just going to go with Hao first, and then Katerina, and then Ashish. How would you define malicious use?
To me, malicious use is something that is illegal and something that you wouldn't use, you know, you don't even need deepfakes to achieve, or any of these AI synthesized media. Anything that's illegal by lying or by committing certain frauds, I think that's malicious to me.
Thank you. Katerina.
To me, do I have sound? Great. To me, malicious use is intentionally spreading false or misleading information and using this technology to do that.
And Ashish?
Yeah, malicious use is using technology with an intention to harm.
Okay, so I hope that our user online is satisfied with the answer. There is clearly no single way of defining malicious use, but I think every definition provided is relevant and applicable. Let's go now to dig a little bit deeper, and I have actually two questions for Hao that I'm going to combine in one. One is, the first part is trying to, in your presentation, a key kind of a link between input and output was the latent code, which appears to be a key kind of component of the generation part of deepfakes or synthetic media. Can you elaborate a little bit on that and how it works, but particularly doing so in the context of answering this other question, which is, do you think deepfakes could work the other way around, meaning make public figures disassociate themselves from responsibility of their actions in reality, as long as there is no public with the argument that it is, in fact, a deepfake? So over to you.
Yeah, so to explain a bit like how latent code works, maybe the simple way to think about them is the first time when, many people think about, how AI or deep neural networks are being used, it's often associated with computer vision task, which is object recognition. So you have, you see a little dog, and then your system says, this is a dog. And the generation part is basically turning this the other way around, which is you have some code, and then you tell the deep neural network, instead of parsing from an image to certain words, to generate the content itself. So the idea here is that you take some input image, you can compress this into some feature vector, literally just like vectors with numbers in it. And then what you do is you have a decoder that can regenerate this into the original content, or something as close as possible to the original content. So that's basically what the latent code does. Now, going to the question of if we can make, yeah, of course, you can make people say and do whatever you want, but as of now, most of these most effective methods rely on a performer to drive the content. So, for example, when you look at the original deepfakes that is face swapping, you have a performer behind that is driving what the content is doing. Obviously, we've seen in this presentation, also in the previous presentation, how this could be combined with content that is generated by deep neural networks or AI itself. But then that is something that is, to create something very convincing will take still a little bit of time. But for now, we can assume that anything that is driven by some, that is convincing, is driven by another performer. And that's how many of these detection methods actually work. Thank you.
The next question is for Katerina, and is regarding GPT-3. Sorry. What is the difference to human-driven campaigns? Is it just a question of cost and scale?
What is the difference between?
Between a campaign powered by GPT-3 or humans instead?
Yes, it is. Right now, it's a question of how much access you have to compute to generate that many messages. Some argue that it's still cheaper to have human content farms, especially if you don't really pay them much, than trying to generate that much processing power. Because even with GPT-2, to run a model on continuously, to generate content continuously, will take some computing power and not just a single laptop. But that's not really something that would stop a determined actor, whether it's an individual with some resources or a non-state actor, like an influence for hire type of firm, or definitely a state actor. That's not a problem.
Thank you. And I'd like now to follow up with Ashish. There are many questions, and everyone who connects to the Slido platform can see them, that refer to possible responses, whether technical or more governance responses. And we do have two panels actually in the afternoon dedicated to that. So please do stick around for those. But Ashish, just as an immediate follow-up to the different kind of types or buckets of mitigation responses that you've listed in your slides, do you feel that there is one that is the most critical to achieve a positive outcome, or is it really a kind of comprehensive approach?
Yeah, no, so I'll again reiterate that this is a complex problem. It requires multimodal solutions. So you have to think about different countermeasures. But if I have to pick one, then I'll say media literacy or awareness is the most important one. Because at the end of the day, right, deepfakes or this is just a tool, right? We have to make sure that individuals in society are resilient to these disinformation campaigns, or which deepfakes are used to spread disinformation campaigns. So I'll pick media literacy awareness as the first principle, and then everything else is following that. Is like, hey, we should have regulations, we should have policies, we should have technology, but we have to own the responsibility to be manipulated as well, right? So essentially, if we know more, if we are more, if we become more discerned citizens through these tools of media literacy, will better serve the society as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think this is also relevant because in your presentation, you specify that technology can prompt humans to take certain actions. Do not visit this website. If it's the portal tells you not to, it's probably a good idea to take that advice, but definitely responses remain human-centric and human-driven, and it is, media literacy is probably the first way of making sure that, as one of the questions actually asked, that the public is in a way, armed or is ready, is prepared to counter the risks emerging from these technologies. And now I have another question for all of you now, and I'm actually going to take inspiration from a slide that Katerina showed about the triad, if you want, between the data, the algorithms, and the computing power that goes in it. And I want to bridge that with one point that Nina made in her keynote address about the democratization being one of the main risks. Now, if one focuses on what Katerina mentioned about the significant computing power, you need a lot of data, you need very sophisticated algorithms, and you need a lot of computing power. One that is not particularly familiar with the subject might believe that then this immediately excludes certain actors that do not have access to all of these three things from becoming a potential malicious user of this technology. However, it is my understanding, and I would like you potentially to elaborate for us and the audience, it is my understanding that on the market now you can find everything as a service. You can procure data. If it's not open source, you can procure data as a service. And this is, again, when we agree to all the small prints on platforms, when we say we agree for this platform to share our data with third parties, it's usually very small print. That is data as a service. You can find apps or other types of more sophisticated algorithms as a service, and you can find computing power again as a service. So how is this kind of commercialization of all of the three pillars of the triad that Katerina mentioned? How is it driving democratization, and is it something that we should be concerned about? We saw again GPT-3, probably by the end of the day I'll manage to pronounce it correctly, as a vetting process for users. But beyond that, what can we do? And maybe, I don't know, let's mix it up a little. Ashish, you want to go first?
Yeah, no, so thank you. So this is an important one, because even though it requires a lot of data, it requires computing power, and it requires sophisticated algorithms, but bad actors and opportunists are finding ways to make it really, really easy for an individual to just buy, this service, right, to create deepfakes for a couple of dollars, right? Now, we have to differentiate that, if you really want to create very, very sophisticated deepfakes versus a deepfake which is can spread or create harm. They're different things, right? If you want to create a Hollywood-like deepfakes, it will require some, more effort versus these services. But with that said, so that is one thing, right? I have used some of those services for my research as well as for some interesting internal work to demonstrate the power of these services. Spend less than $10 actually to create deepfakes, which actually was very, very. They were not sophisticated, but they did the job. So that's one. The other thing I want to say is the problem that we also have is the world is very, very flat now, and it's very, very small. Technology is ubiquitous across, right? These platforms, like both the creator platform and the distribution platform, I mean to say like access to GPT-3, or Microsoft, Google, and Amazon Cloud, anyone across the globe, most of those people can use it. And then on the other side, distribution platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and others are also global. So you can create a piece of deepfakes anywhere in the world, can distribute it to anywhere in the world, and cross those jurisdiction boundaries, which actually may have laws or regulations against it. So that is another problem to this, is not only democratization, as you mentioned, buying dollar worth of services to create deepfakes, but how do you stop deepfakes created in a cheaper way, in a completely different jurisdiction, to actually have an impact or threat in other side of the world?
Thank you. Katerina, you want to go next?
Sure. I think a chief challenge that I had pointed to in my presentation as well is this tension between pushing research forward and releasing it openly in order to validate it, in order to push it forward, and releasing it openly and making it available. You have an example that Hao talked about, StyleGAN2, for example, novel model that created deepfake images. And then someone puts up a demo, creates this person does not exist, and now images from that site are appearing in influence campaigns. Very easy for anyone to scrape the site and get a novel image of a person that doesn't actually exist. So in terms of accessibility, I think the costs come when you're trying to build a novel model, like GPT-3, like GPT-2 before it. This is where the high costs come in. Once they're built and they're released openly, GPT-3 right now is not released openly, but Illusory AI is building an open source equivalent of it, and it will become open eventually, which means that it's now accessible to anyone to play around with for good or evil. And the only cost at that point becomes how easy is it to call through API calls? How easy is it to use? Has someone created a demo or an application that's wrapped around that model to make it even easier to do that, like a text equivalent of this person does not exist? And whether they have a high enough processing power. Now, you can get laptops with pretty high processing power already, but you can also use compute as a service. You know, you can use it on the cloud, and I don't have the figures off the top of my head of what it costs, but it's getting cheaper and cheaper for users to be able to do that. And another point, and the final point I'll say, is that these models are sort of general purpose and trained on massive amount of data, but if you are a malicious actor that wants something a little more specific, you can use a principle called fine-tuning. It's a technique in AI where you can retrain this model on a smaller, tiny data set of very specific terminology and use it to your advantage. So now it becomes from very big and very general to very specific to your application that you want to do. So there are a lot of issues in this space, and as Jack Clark, formerly of OpenAI, says, is that AI industry is in this in this stage before they have principles of do no harm truly sort of crystallized. There's an open debate, and it's a debate that this body, this community, needs to pay attention to, because this is this tension between advancing research and advancing science, and how much or how little of it to really push and open publicly is something that is raging within the AI community right now. And we need to arrive at some degrees of principles of ethical release of something that has potential harm.
Thank you. Hao, over to you.
Yeah, I think Katerina is bringing a really important point, which is it's not just data being available, not just more compute that is accessible, but the whole research is open source. And this is something that makes the development of these technologies, you know, move so rapidly that we can't. So here's an example. I can't even imagine, like, things that I see in the next computer vision conference that is possible. Half a year ago, I would think that, you know, I don't think this is going to be possible in the near future, but it's that fast. And it makes it really hard to catch up with what is available out there. Even having an overview of that is like a full-time job. And what it means is that the technology is progressing so fast that, you know, again, regulations are hard to impose because we don't know what the capabilities are. We don't know what applications are that people are developing. But what that means is that the thing that we're trying to solve is how do we prevent harm? How do we make sure that people are using it properly? And I think this would have to start with how do we educate people or developers. They have to be responsible. They have to have, a clear ethical mind from the beginning when they develop things, and not, think about what can I use this for harm, but what are the potential consequences of whatever I'm developing. So I think this is something that should be part of any, company that is developing using these kind of technologies. Should be part of the curriculum for anyone, computer scientists and anyone using these kind of technologies, and also for governments as well, right? How they are, what kind of data they are collecting, what kind of data they're analyzing. I think a lot of these things have, how AI is being used for defense purposes. So I think we need to impose certain regulations and also educate people on how to use that. I think that's probably the first step.
Thank you. I'm afraid we're running out of time, but to wrap up this super interesting panel, I just have one last question to all of you. And I would like you to answer, giving me a number in terms of how many years do you think we are away from a scenario in which there could be a complex deepfake attack that involves different different medias, different type of media. So you have the same actor that is producing a video deepfake that is then corroborated by text, by maybe a fake embassy cable or intelligence cable that is then corroborated again by someone on the phone doing voice cloning and saying, yeah, this is really happening. Of course, the impact that deepfakes will have will depend on the context. Are we at peacetime? Are we already in a situation of political crisis between different actors? Are we already in a military crisis that could potentially escalate? But this is, as a setup for the next panel, how far do you think we are from cross-media complex, like deepfake attacks that match pretty much every single type of scientific media that Ashish showed on the media in the hands of malicious actors? How? Go first.
I love these questions. So I think technically it's already possible to produce an extremely convincing deepfake. It can be real-time, as you see, and we can even improve the quality of whatever I've shown already. The question is, how fast can people adopt that, and how can people replicate this, right? So given that, the question is, what is the right, I think the question is, what is the right platform where they're the most dangerous? Social media platforms could be dangerous, but I think they also have very sophisticated mechanisms to detect if something is not right. It doesn't even have to be a deepfake. You have a lot of teams that are working on fake news detection, fact checking. So there are mechanisms to protect against that. But you can still hack an account. You can still use a video chat to make someone believe it's you. I think a sophisticated attack is technically already possible. I think the question when people would adopt these kind of things, probably in a year or two, where you'll have more instances of that. I think that's my gut feeling, but hopefully we'll never come to that.
Thank you. Ashish, 30 seconds.
Yeah, I wish we never come to that, but I can tell you, in the hands of people with resources, especially nation states, can actually execute something like that in next 2 to 5 years easily, or even sooner.
Thank you. And Katerina?
Well, there's a difference between can and will, as both Hao and Ashish pointed out. Can, 0 years. It can be done today. Will it be done is a bigger question. And if we're talking about a non-state actor or a state-sponsored type of situation, I am fairly confident that our intelligence community can adapt rather quickly because of the different metrics that we take into account to understand what's going on. Question is, why would someone do this, and whether they would want to burn that kind of capability on being detected and attributed to, and the consequences that come with that.
Thank you. With that, please, allow me to conclude the panel. It's been super interesting. I do hope that everyone in the virtual physical room now feels like they understand enough of the problem to engage meaningfully in the discussions later on. Thank you so much, Katerina and Ashish, for your contributions. It's been fascinating, and I've learned a lot. So thank you very much for your time, even though you're based far away. And it's been a pleasure. So we're now going to break for about 10 minutes, and we will resume at 11:30 Geneva time with the following panel on the international security implications of deepfakes. So we're going to be moving from the technology to the actual impact it may have on international security. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll see you again in 10 minutes. Thanks.